Part 1 of this series went through the Freedom of Information request submitted by the independent Senator Rex Patrick. What he wanted from Scott Morrison was access to National Cabinet documents. Morrison refused and then lost a massive case in the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. Part 2 of this series went through how much of a joke the government's case was. Following that, Senator Patrick also submitted a new FOI request for additional National Cabinet documents. But it wasn't all over. Transparency didn't suddenly prevail, because instead of appealing the decision, what Scott Morrison did instead was to rush a new piece of law into Parliament. The government that doesn't have time to introduce anti-corruption legislation had time to introduce the COAG Legislation Amendment Bill 2021.
On behalf of the Assistant Minister to the Prime Minister and Cabinet, I present the COAG Legislation Amendment Bill 2021 and the explanatory memorandum. Mr Speaker, the COAG Legislation Amendment Bill 2021 amends legislation to deal with the cessation of the Council of Australian Governments and the establishment of the National Cabinet and the National Federation Reform Council. This bill ushers in a new and exciting era for our federation.
Okay, ushering in a new and exciting era for our federation doesn't sound too bad. Tell us more.
Recognising the cessation of the former COAG model, the review also recommended that the Commonwealth should introduce legislation to the Parliament to amend outdated references to COAG councils and ministerial forums. And this is what this bill seeks to do.
And this is where it gets interesting. In that speech, there are references to a review that recommended that the government bring this legislation into existence. The review he's talking about is the review of COAG councils and ministerial forums. Now, this review came about because National Cabinet asked for recommendations on how best to replace the existing intergovernment meetings known as COAG. And in fact, the review did recommend that the Commonwealth should introduce legislation to amend outdated references. So maybe it is just coincidence that the review was completed at the same time that Scott Morrison lost his case against Senator Rex Patrick. No, that's not it. The review was released in October of 2020. That's almost 1 year before this legislation was introduced. It's pretty obvious that the recommendation by the review to legislate a change of outdated references was not an urgent matter. But once you read the details of the bill, right at the end, you see the real reason it was rushed in. To make clear that where Commonwealth legislation makes provisions to protect from disclosure the deliberations and decisions of the Cabinet and its committees, these provisions also apply to the National Cabinet. By the way, the review which this bill is meant to be based off makes zero mention of the need for confidentiality or any changes to freedom of information laws. The government, now knowing full well that National Cabinet doesn't fall under the freedom of information exemptions, is legislating it to force it to fall under the Cabinet definition. This bill is currently in Parliament. It hasn't yet passed. And if it passes, then it covers more of the government's actions in secrecy. Experts have ridiculed what the government is trying to do, but this government hates transparency. Even after the tribunal decision, they haven't bothered to update the records to show the full disclosure that was required. It's only because Senator Patrick has released the documents on his website that the public has a copy at all. And I thought it couldn't get any worse, but it does. Remember I said that Senator Patrick put in requests for the additional National Cabinet documents he didn't initially ask for? He's expecting those requests to also be rejected and is flagging further legal action. And that's because since the tribunal decision, the government has been rejecting National Cabinet Freedom of Information requests on basically the exact same grounds that were overruled by the judge. Scott Morrison is completely ignoring the decision. What the government is doing is stalling for just enough time for the new legislation to pass, after which point secrecy will apply. In other words, the government is making up its own interpretation of the law. My question here is, where is the opposition in all this? Why is it that a single independent senator is the one shutting down the government's games? Senator Patrick has been doing a good job, but let's hope for our sake that he keeps winning most of the fights.